all of the defensive mechanisms, the people-pleasing, the avoidance, the self-sabotage, the splitting, projecting, all of that just gets in the way of the healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And I guess, does all of this come back to when you're living with a shame-based identity? That you can't be vulnerable. You can't allow yourself to be vulnerable because that vulnerability leaves you so exposed. And when you have this core belief of shame, I'm broken, I'm bad, I'm unworthy, then vulnerability just lands right in that pit of shame. And so is this why there's such an extreme avoidance of vulnerability?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, you're going to hear a clip from an interview I did with Renee Swanson, a certified life coach and the host of the Covert Narcissism podcast. With over a decade of experience, she helps survivors break from emotional abuse, rebuild confidence, and reclaim their lives. I always enjoy my conversations with Renee. She brings a grounded, compassionate clarity to topics that are often emotionally overwhelming. She has a way of making people feel seen without judgment, and I think that comes through in this discussion. One of the themes we focused on in our conversation was shame, how central it is to the experience of narcissism, and how rarely it gets named. Shame has a way of working in the shadows. It doesn't just make you feel bad, it makes you feel like you are bad. It leaves you exposed, judged, and alone, not only in the eyes of others, but in the eyes of the harsh internal voices that you've carried for years. And the worst part? You often don't even realize it's shame. You just know you want to disappear. You withdraw, shut down, attack yourself, or shift into someone you think is more acceptable. All the while, what you're really doing is protecting something unbearably painful underneath. In this segment, Renee and I dig into how shame operates quietly but powerfully, how it hides behind in silence, perfectionism, defensiveness, and even grandiosity. Understanding the role it plays in narcissistic dynamics is the first step toward healing what feels unworthy inside. Let's dive in. I hope this conversation brings some clarity, insight, or even a sense of relief wherever it happens to meet you.
So today we're digging into these two deeply human and often misunderstood experiences or emotions, and those two things are shame and guilt. These emotions, they shape how we see ourselves, for sure. They shape how we relate to other people. They shape how we handle adult relationships in life. But many of us don't really understand it. We might carry guilt that doesn't belong to us, or shame that was planted in us that had nothing to do with who we are. And so, Dr. Mazzella, I'm really excited to explore these, and I'm really glad that you're here to help us understand the difference, and more importantly, how we can heal on this path. So let's dive in. What is shame?
And I'll just add one more thing, and I'm excited for you to help me understand the difference as well, because I'm very curious in how you think about this. And I could tell already, just by your brief introduction, that there's already some overlap in terms of the way we think about it, because one of the ways I think about shame is a deeply disorganizing affective state that arises when one feels exposed, judged, or misunderstood. So shame arises in response to a thought, feeling, or behavior that feels condemned or rejected, often in the eyes of others. So that's like the interpersonal piece that you alluded to just a moment ago, or in the eyes of what we call in my field an internalized other. That just simply means that I know that she will think that I'm a loser, or I know she'll think that I'm a failure. So in other words, it's a feeling that someone carries around inside of themselves that they confuse with what they think other people are going to view them. I like to emphasize that part because so much of shame, and we'll get into this, has to do with gaze. So you could see already, shame is more than just an emotion. It's a relational and intrapsychic experience, often unconscious as well. So we need to get into that, Renee.
Absolutely.
That it shapes the very sense of oneself. So it's not something someone just feels, but they become. So they become shameful. And that is important because you said we want to always keep our eye on what we could call treatment or healing, shame and guilt. And if we think about how they become this feeling, this affective state, already we have to start thinking about how do we address that? How do we help them begin to separate out what's a feeling or an internalized belief from what's actually going to happen or is happening in reality? I know there's obviously more to say, but let me just pause there and see how some of this is landing.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you describe it with like an internalized other, this otherness that's there. I think of shame as being very judgmentally based. So it's how are other people seeing me? And I put into words what I believe that they think, or I believe that they feel, or I believe. And then it becomes identity based because it becomes rooted in a belief that something's wrong with me.
Yes.
And so I'm broken, I'm flawed, I'm unworthy. These are things that go along with that shame based thinking.
Yes.
And again, it's very judgmentally grounded. So we end up then judging ourselves. Like it becomes who we are, like what you're talking about. And we just go forward carrying that shame or that belief system. Like, is it an emotion? I like that you called it an experience. It's almost a belief system that I am bad, I'm broken, I'm unworthy, I'm flawed. All of the things that then leads to behaviors that are very self-sabotaging.
Let me jump in right there. So this is such a nice pivot point. So these feelings like disgust, unlovable, defective, whatever, the listeners can fill in the blank here because it varies, in terms of how you begin to degrade yourself. But what happens then is this promotes an immediate defensive response. So what we typically see is splitting, projection, devaluation, or withdrawal. That's like a retreat. So the psyche does this in order to restore like some kind of emotional balance, because obviously it's too painfully difficult to be walking around with all these different feelings, or else we would just stay in bed all day because, again, that gaze of the other, we don't want to be seen and judged. So these defenses are mobilized automatically and very quickly, oftentimes before shame can even be fully registered.
Right. Well, it's the defensive response. Is this because that shame or those beliefs and experiences are a threat to us?
Yeah, they're a
and
threat.
So it's a threat response.
Yes, so there's a threat because these feelings are not just, we'll get into this a little bit more when we go into the development of shame, but since it starts at such an early age, these are not just typical feelings like I mentioned before. This can become completely disorganizing, or what we call, again in my field, annihilation anxiety. Like it annihilates one's sense of self. Like they don't even feel like they belong or they deserve to belong in this world. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It does lead one down that path of, can they get help or what? And I know we'll get into this, but that belief that I don't even deserve help. Like that's part of that shame-based thinking.
Yes.
If people really knew me, they would leave. I always mess everything up. So I don't deserve even to get the help.
Yeah. And that often leads them. So one way to deal with it is those defenses that I mentioned, right? Like, and we'll go through some of those if we have time in terms of the splitting and projection. But another way is to hide. And this is typically what you see as well, especially with people who are narcissistically vulnerable. They hide. They have different ways of hiding that can range all the way from what? Needing to withdraw. So they don't, they have a hard time just getting out, getting to work, or they hide behind what's known as a false self. That's the grandiose self, the structure that holds the narcissist together. So you often hear this with people who are narcissistically disturbed is when they get in a group. They have a really hard time. They do much better one-on-one, they say, because in the group, it's the same thing. They become withdrawn or they suddenly feel like they have nothing to contribute.
Right.
But that's the hiding, because if they expose themselves, if they share something personal, they're going to be exposed. People will see them, right?
Yeah. I would love to dive into this a little bit if you're good with that.
Yeah.
Of, what are some of the common signs and behaviors that indicate that someone's living with this, I guess we'll say, unrecognized shame? You've mentioned splitting and the hiding, and I would even maybe go so far as to say it can even be the people pleasing and the perfectionism that can come out. Also, then we're hiding behind this image that we present to the world. Even self-sabotaging behavior can be what we are hiding behind.
Let's take a quick break.
I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly, but I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there. Yeah, absolutely. So that image that you just described, that's, again, depending on what circles you run around in, but we could call that the false self. There are different names for it. There's the grandiose sense. But yeah, that people pleasing is indeed another way that this presents. So you wouldn't think that's shame if you just see people pleasing on the surface. But it is, because then you're never really coming out. You're performing, right? It's performative, so you're not really being exposed. Another way it could present itself, I'm just thinking out loud, is someone who has a hard time getting in a relationship. If we're working with them and we finally get them to the point where they muster up the courage to go on a date, and they meet someone on one of these online services, and immediately they say, well, I don't think I'm going to go on that date because I think this guy is lying to me about his age. He put up a picture of himself from 8 years ago. So already I know this guy's a liar. There's no reason I'm going to cancel. So what is that? That's a couple of things, Renee, right? One is they're hiding. So they come up with some rationale why not to go out on a date. And sometimes this happens when they go out on a date and they meet the person, they come up with something that's going to work, some reality of why they can't go back.
Right.
But it also touches on the defenses that I just mentioned, right? Because in accusing somebody of lying, what they're saying is, they don't use these words, because remember I said this stuff could be unconscious, but you should be ashamed of yourself putting up a picture from 8 years ago. That's what we call projection, right? So the shame then inside oneself isn't really recognized. It gets split off, because I'm not shameful, and projected. You should be embarrassed of yourself, the way that you present.
Right. Right. No, I think those are actually great points. And the projection is not one I've thought of as a way that hiding with that shame. I just haven't made that connection. And I love that.
Well, I thought of you, actually, Renee. Let me just tell you why. Not that you project, but covert narcissist.
We all project.
That's true. We do.
We all do to some extent.
But the covert narcissists are experts at it, because if you think of someone with covert narcissism, one of the common characteristics is what? That they always need to be right. They're devaluing other people. They're very critical, sometimes in covert ways, but they have a very subtle way of putting people down. But another way to describe that is they make other people feel ashamed.
Right.
And this is a wonderful solution for them in their mind, because then they could get rid of whatever shame that then they don't have to really ever deal with.
Right. No, I definitely have thought of it in regards to that it's their way of dumping their shame onto other people. I just had not quite made the connection of it being a defensive mechanism.
Yeah.
Against
and if
the
you
shame.
could think of it that way, again, since we're keeping our eye on healing, right? How do we help somebody? One way to help somebody with this is to slowly begin to what we call integration. So if something is getting split off and projected slowly over time, not immediately, we can't just interpret this stuff because they're getting rid of it for a reason, and we have to respect that. But we have to then figure out a way, and we could talk about that when we get more into the treatment, but how to help them reintegrate it or get it integrated back into themselves.
Absolutely.
Because as you can imagine, this doesn't make for such healthy relationships, right?
No, it gets in the way.
Yeah.
Yes. All of the defensive mechanisms, the people-pleasing, the avoidance, the self-sabotage, the splitting, projecting, all of that just gets in the way of the healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And I guess, does all of this come back to when you're living with a shame-based identity? That you can't be vulnerable. You can't allow yourself to be vulnerable because that vulnerability leaves you so exposed. And when you have this core belief of shame, I'm broken, I'm bad, I'm unworthy, then vulnerability just lands right in that pit of shame. And so is this why there's such an extreme avoidance of vulnerability?
Yeah, it's a funny thing because in working with these individuals who have these narcissistic characteristics, what you frequently see when you pay close attention is they are very vulnerable, you know, and this is like the fragment itself. This is about splitting again, is they appear very much in one way until they, you know, until you're confronted with reality. And then oftentimes what you see is the other side of it, which is the complete collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're very vulnerable and needy and pathetic and worthless.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, Renee, most of the time with your sort of prototypical narcissistically disturbed individual, you do not see that vulnerability because that whole falseness that you and I described earlier, the false self or the grandiosity, hides it very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to admit, I mean, earlier you mentioned it could also present, I think you said, in self-sabotage, right?
Yes.
Because shame, this is the other critical piece that I wanted to mention, it doesn't lend itself well to words. So it oftentimes goes unspoken. So if it goes unspoken, it has to come out somehow. And one way you could see it is in the body or in the behavior, in the stomach, or if someone has a feeling in their chest, or they say like the pit of their stomach, or they have all sorts of psychosomatic problems as well. Mm-hmm. So these are all things that we could say, I wonder if shame is coming out in some derivative way, in a way that doesn't have to be expressed verbally, but gets expressed nevertheless.
Right. Right. And I think your example a little while ago about the, you know, going out on a date or going out to meet somebody, the self-sabotage hits there when they're going to just find reasons for there to be a problem. We're going to find, even though this might end up being a great relationship full of trust and safety, they sabotage it and go, you know, well, they're not going to like me and they don't like me because of this reason or whatever. It's very self-sabotaging, even when there's good things present in their life that they sabotage it.
Yeah, and they sabotage at work too. So like an example with work would be the woman who comes in and again, musters up the courage to talk in a meeting. So she participates, but the boss doesn't pay attention or doesn't pick up on her comment. And immediately like that, she begins like, well, first she may have an experience in her stomach, like I mentioned a moment ago. But when you help them begin to work through this, then it's like, what a stupid comment that was. What an idiot I am. And then it interferes, just like intimacy in relationships, because she may not then participate in the next meeting because she doesn't want to be exposed again in that way, because she knows the way everybody's really looking at her. You know, like what's wrong with her?
Or she thinks she knows. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah.
And that's just it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So where does all this shame originate?
Okay. Let's go back.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah. So I think it depends to some extent, sort of what theory you subscribe to. And the theory's not as important, but you should have a theory in mind because again, I know I keep saying this, but it's good to remember we're always thinking about healing and treating this. And in order to heal it and treat it, you need a theory in terms of where it comes from. Like even if it's defenses, like you and I mentioned earlier, well, then we have to appreciate how to work with defenses. If you believe someone is fragmented, how do you help them become more integrated? So one theory says that developmentally, shame arrives very, very early in life, especially when a child is misattuned to, is shamed or humiliated, or is left feeling exposed, right? When they have a need. That's like really a critical piece of it. So it starts like, let's say a child expresses a need of some sort. Like I'll give an example to answer the question that may be a little bit more helpful. So a child is bullied at school and they come home and they're very upset and they tell their parent. And the father, let's just say an example is like, stop acting like such a sissy, or you're such a baby, or why don't you just get over it? You're being too sensitive, you know, something along those lines. And this stuff is very common. Even in talking to people on my podcast, you hear the way they treat their own children without even knowing, like, you know, my daughter's having a hard time sleeping and I tell her, oh, you know, your little sister sleeps through the night, right? And it's like, they don't fully appreciate that these experiences, when someone comes with a need, so there's the exposure, right? And then they're left with a feeling of rejection or humiliation. And if this happens enough over time, it's no longer about a behavior or a feeling like you and I were saying earlier, but this is who I am. Like I am someone who is, and they identify then with that voice. That's the internalization piece. So they internalize like a mocking voice as kind of like a moral authority, like it's harsh or demeaning, but the main point is it's absolute. Like, in other words, there's a conviction of it. Remember I said a moment ago, they believe, and you said, well, I said they're going to be judged, and you said they believe, but that's the space that's missing.
Right. But and it's reality to them.
Yeah, exactly. And if you try to tell them, well, that's just your belief, they're going to feel insulted. They won't get that. You know, like work has to be done to create that space before you could just come in and tell them your reality is off. But anyway, so that's where it starts very early in life with this need that then gets humiliated or disregarded, or there's some kind of lack of attunement. And they begin to feel like this is just who they are, inherently bad, or not even worth, the time if you have a dismissive parent, which, by the way, you may have a narcissistically preoccupied parent who could be very dismissive of feelings because they can't get in touch with their own feelings. So no way are they going to tolerate them in you.
Yeah. No, and that's a really, really good point. And so then you've got a narcissistic parent, potentially, a narcissistically tuned parent who shame is a core part of their own identity. And so you talk about the projection, because that then gets all of the shame gets dumped onto their child.
Yes.
And that child, it just creates this, I've called it a generational curse that could just get passed on and on. But that's not the only place that this can develop, a shame-based belief system in a child. I do think, a lot of it can originate through parenting, but are we also then exploring that it could come from a religious system or a cultural system?
Well,
or,
tell me about that. Tell me, yes, I'm very curious. Let's stay with the religious one. What were you thinking now?
So on the religious, being raised in a very heavily identified religious culture, that the belief was that I was never good enough on my own accord, that I'm faulted, I'm human, therefore I'm a sinner. And so I am in need of redemption, which there are good things to this, I'm not just knocking all of that. But when a child, I internalized it so deeply that I believed I was bad. I was faulty. Yes. I was unworthy. I internalized it as a very shame-oriented mindset. And so while it did not come for me from, a narcissistic style parenting, it definitely came for me from a religious background.
Well, let me tease that apart just a moment. I appreciate this example, this sort of personal anecdote. But where were the parents in that? Did they have any sense that you were feeling this way? Or is this just the way that everybody, maybe that your parents felt this way and this was just the norm, like a normal way to feel about oneself?
Yes, I think it was the norm. It was what my parents had been fed as well. And it got continually passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah.
And so where my parents are extremely loving individuals, but they were very grounded in this mindset from the church as well. And so their parenting style reflected what the church belief was of, I'm only worthy in as much as I'm willing to accept God's love in my life. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to force it back into my theory, but let me just tell you how I'm hearing it. So the parenting style is the church. So when I said a parent or a caregiver, maybe I could just open that up to not mean it so literally, but the parent or caregiver can be the church then. It could be anybody in your life. Maybe I should put it that way, who is, the arbiter of the truth. They know the truth and the way that you should feel if you're, and how you need to repent because you're not worthy and all that.
Right. So it would be the one that the child puts on that pedestal. As a child, you're going to put these large people in your life, whether that be your mom or your dad or your grandmother or your uncle or the church. It's where does that pedestal sit? And therefore, I get all of my worth by meeting the needs of that person or institution.
Yeah, that's actually it. So I'm glad we opened it up with this example. So thank you for that. So I would say it's any figure or idealized image in your mind, right? That could be shaming. So it doesn't have to be a caregiver per se, but what a caregiver represents to you. Absolutely. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because it could be a cult, right?
It absolutely could be.
Oh, Renee, it could be the drug dealer on the corner, right? If this discussion resonated with you and you'd like to hear more, stay tuned. I'll be sharing another clip from our conversation very soon. But if you're eager to dive into the full interview now, you can head over to Renee's video channel. I'll include the link in the show notes below. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this clip on shame. As always, thank you for listening and take good care of yourselves. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.